We can't.
Five.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Put your glass down. Hi, everyone, from Dunrovin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. This is Suzanne Miller with a broadcast of Tall Tales from Life's Trails. It's a very cold and rainy November 1st, 2018. And I have a very special guest with me. This is a man I have loved for over 50 years. We've been married for over 50 years. And this is my husband, Sterling. You want to wave at everyone? And I thought it would be fun for you to hear about some of his bear work. Bears are a passion, have been a passion for Sterling's for a very long time. And I am very proud to say that Sterling is one of the world's most renowned bear researchers. And he has worked on all 3 North American bears. And I'll let him explain. First of all, let's tell people how we met Sterling, and we can fight over who's right on this story, by the way. I'm sure we have different versions. You tell your version. You go first.
Well, I'm from Wisconsin originally, and I came out to study wildlife management and wildlife biology at the University of Montana, which has one of the best wildlife programs in the United States. In 1966, and in I think the following year in '67, Suzanne was a forestry major. And we met. I first noticed her when she was checking cards at the food service, and I would arrange to go through her line at the food service, so she could check my cards. We could have a few words, and then we met in a class we took together, a soils class, because she was studying forestry. We both had to take that class, so I arranged to sit next to her and chat her up. And we started dating, and then about a year later, we got married.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's fairly accurate, I have to say. I'm impressed that you remembered some of the details.
So I graduated in '68, and I was heading to graduate school at the University of Washington. So Suzanne left and finished her undergraduate work at the University of Washington.
Yeah, Sterling had what they called a blonde scholarship. I stopped going to school and worked for a year in Seattle to establish residency in Washington, and then went back to school, and the rest, as they say, is history. I went to graduate school there, as did you. You got a PhD in wildlife biology. And tell them what your PhD dissertation was on.
Well, I our original graduate project at the University of Washington is my professor wanted to send me and another guy over to Pakistan to study the wild boars of Pakistan. But there was a revolution in Pakistan and a lot of disruptions, so that project fell by the wayside. So I ended up doing a master's degree on small mammals in the Seattle area. And after that degree, I decided to go into the Peace Corps in Chile. Suzanne and I did. So we joined the Peace Corps. The University of Washington was the academic backup to forestry, including wildlife programs in Chile. And so Suzanne and I went down to Chile and worked there for 2.5 years. I, as a wildlife biologist, working on a field guide to the mammals of Chile, and Suzanne was working as a biometrician for a fisheries research institute in Chile.
I was what they called a non-matrix spouse. That is, in those days, the government of Chile didn't want people from the Peace Corps from the United States, so they only took a set number of Peace Corps volunteers, and they wanted Sterling, but they didn't want me, so I had to find my own job. And I found it with United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, working in fisheries research. Anyway, we had a great time in Chile, but that relates to your dissertation. Tell them how it relates to your, your PhD dissertation.
So I was doing a lot of work on the mammals of Chile, and so I ended up parlaying my 2.5 years of looking at the mammals of Chile into a dissertation on the status see, what was it? Uh, I can't even remember the name of it right now, but it had to do with wildlife and man in Chile, how the wildlife got to its current status in Chile, which is depleted in many areas, and that involved looking, among other things, into the chronicles of the 15th century Spanish conquistadores in Chile, and because they were pretty keen observers of natural history, and they wrote down what they saw. And we concluded, or I concluded in my dissertation, among other things, that at the time of European contact in Chile, many of the mammal species were already quite depleted by land use practices primarily, because they were agricultural Indians that had extensive modifications of their habitat. So many of the species that are rare now, like a species of deer called the way mule, and species of camels like guanaco and vicuña, which are wild ancestors of llamas and alpacas, were already rare at the time of human contact, or of European contact with the natives of South America.
Yeah, one of my memories of going out in the field with Sterling is the smallest deer. Is it in the world or just in the Americas? The poodoo.
The poodoo is the smallest deer in the world. It's a really tiny deer, about this size, and it lives in south central Chile, in kind of a temperate rainforest area.
Right, and we captured one.
Yes, yeah.
That was really exciting. But after that, we went to Alaska, and you became very involved in bear research. And can you tell us how that unfolded for you?
Well, as in most jobs, you start off doing grunt work. I went up to Chile.
Up to Alaska.
Up to Alaska, because Suzanne was there. And so I took a job with the Alaska Fish and Game Department. Suzanne was already working for the Alaska Fish and Game Department in a different division. I was working in the Wildlife Division, and she had been working in the Fisheries Division as a biometrician. And so I started working, and I ended up analyzing some data that had been collected, not very well. And that then when a research job opened up, it happened to be on bears, and I applied for it, and I got it on the basis that they knew I could do research and write up papers and do analysis. And so that ended up, that's how I got started in bears, is that project. The initial project had to do with an environmental impact assessment of the impact of a huge proposed hydroelectric dam on the Susitna River in south central Chile. And so I ended up working on that project for 5 years, and then I managed to parlay that primary work into an additional 15 years of work or so following up on that environmental impact assessment work. And my primary focus was the impact of heavy hunting pressure on brown bears and black bears in the south central Alaska range.
Okay, now a lot of people don't understand that brown bears are grizzly bears, and tell people why is there a change of names? Why are brown bears called brown bears in parts of Alaska and called grizzly bears in other parts of Alaska, and everybody calls a grizzly in Montana a grizzly bear? What's up with that?
There's a lot of confusion about that. I suppose that's the most commonly asked question that I get asked. What's the difference between a brown bear and a grizzly bear? And the simple answer is there isn't really one. Taxonomically, there is no distinction, but it's commonly, brown bears are the common name for the grizzly or brown bear that lives in coastal areas and eats salmon. They tend to be much larger and darker. But they interbreed with and are completely overlap with in all kinds of characteristics, including color and behavior, with the smaller bears in interior that are commonly called grizzly bears that don't have access to salmon. Salmon is a really rich food source, and the bears that have access to lots of salmon, like in coastal areas and places like Kodiak, grow much bigger. And so they commonly think that is thought to be distinct in the common perception, but from the scientific basis, there is no real difference.
And
they're all Ursus arctos.
And we have two skulls in front of us here. Can you talk about each one? And do you know, first of all, where did you get the skulls, and where did the bears come from, and how were they killed?
Well, these are, this is an Alaska brown bear, and this is an Alaskan black bear. And Suzanne and I have a friend named Larry Allmiller, who's a fanatic about skulls. He just really likes skulls, and he collects a lot of them. And he had hundreds of skulls, and I asked him to give me some, and he gave me these two, which he had cleaned and made up right, and so they're nice and clean, that I use in demonstrations when I talk to kids and so forth. You know, they're always interested in the nutrition. You can see how much bigger the grizzly bear skull is than the black bear skull. You can see the sagittal crest here, which is the place where the muscles attach, and the very heavy zygomatic arch, which is a way of attaching these really strong muscles to the jaw so that they have a really strong jaw and very powerful jaws. Both species, but particularly the brown bear. In the back, since bears are omnivorous, which means they eat both animals that they can catch, like other carnivores, but they also eat, and a bulk of their diet in many places where they don't have access to lots of meat is vegetation. And so they have molar teeth in the back that are good for grinding vegetation.
Bears are often scavengers, are they not? I mean, they certainly kill prey, but they also scavenge.
That's right. And, you know, it's interesting that in places like in Yellowstone Park, once wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone Park, they'd been extirpated there for about 70 years. But around 1997, I think, they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone Park, and that had a beneficial impact on bears and other scavengers in the sense that the wolves would kill creatures like elk and deer and bison, and then the bears would come along and chase them off those kills. And so that was because the wolves are better at killing things than the bears are. So that was a net benefit for the bears that they, when the wolves were introduced to Yellowstone Park.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the focus of your work. In the Susitna project, you were looking at the potential impacts that this big dam would have on bear resources. And there were both grizzlies and black bears in this area, right?
That's right. And so the dam would have flooded a large portion of the habitat, especially of black bears. And when I started the study, I wasn't even sure that there were very many black bears there. But after I got started studying the grizzly bears, we learned that there was a healthy population of black bears right along the river, exactly in the area that would be flooded by the dam. And one of the big impacts on black bears would be that their den sites would be flooded because the bears hibernate in the winter, and grizzly bears tend to hibernate in dens dug at very high elevations on mountainsides, whereas black bears live and den in the forests, those forests occur right along the river. And those are the exact places that the dam would have flooded. So the impact on black bears in this particular area is probably going to be bigger than the impact on grizzly bears.
We have a question from one of our viewers. She would like to know if polar bears and grizzly bears can crossbreed. But in answering that question, would you talk about the distributions of polar bears and grizzly bears and where they might interact?
Yes. It's interesting that polar bears and grizzly bears do rarely interbreed and produce offspring. And with climate change, grizzly bears are moving further north in some areas, particularly in western or eastern Canada, and they're coming more into contact with polar bears in that area. And so most of the hybrids between grizzly bears and polar bears have been found in northeastern Canada. However, it's also the case that in northern Alaska, where I've done some work with polar bears, that there's brown bears live in that same area, like on the north slope of Alaska, in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and so forth. And polar bears and grizzly bears do come in contact with each other there, but I'm not aware of any cases of hybrids occurring in Alaska, only in northeastern Canada.
And do they know whether those hybrids are sterile or not?
I don't. It's a little bit hard to tell because when the way they know about these hybrids is primarily when somebody shoots one, and they're puzzled as to what it is, and then they look at its DNA and determine that it's a hybrid. Usually, let's see if I get this right, usually it's a polar bear father and a brown bear or grizzly bear mother. And it's expected that as climate change advances and it becomes increasingly impossible for polar bears to survive in the habitat of the Arctic ice, where polar bears are adapted to survive, that they will become more and more common, that they will be encountering grizzly bears, and it will be interesting to see what happens. I don't expect that that's going to be any way salvation for the polar bears. I greatly fear that polar bears will be functionally extinct in the world by the end of the century, and probably earlier, because their habitat of ice, the polar ice cap, will be gone, at least in the summer and fall. And polar bears require that floating polar ice cap over shallow offshore waters to survive, because that's where they get their food, which is seals. And polar bears are extremely well adapted to hunting seals. Essentially, the story is that polar bears adapted from brown bears, or evolved from brown bears, probably about 100,000 years ago, when some brown bears started advancing off onto the ice and encountered this rich habitat for seals, and learned how to hunt seals. And then they undertook adaptations to make them better seal hunters, both in their coloration and the padding of their feet, and various other adaptations, which makes them extremely efficient at surviving in these cold winter, in these cold, barren areas where they hunt only seals.
Are polar bears, Sterling, larger? If we had a polar bear skull here, it would be larger than the grizzly bear, would it not?
Well, I would say that the largest polar bears and the largest brown bears are probably pretty much the same size. It's generally thought that that on average polar bears are somewhat larger than brown bears. That's only because there's such a huge range of size in brown bears. The real big ones, as I mentioned earlier, are on coastal areas where they eat a lot of salmon, Whereas they get more and more interior areas where they eat a lot of much more vegetation and relatively less protein, they're much, much smaller, about the size of a black bear. And so they, you know, brown bears and grizzly bears vary a lot in size. But polar bears, because their food source is so rich, are all pretty much large.
So how much would an average brown bear weigh, an average black bear weigh, and an average polar bear weigh? What would be
both, as I mentioned, brown bears and black bears can vary tremendously in size depending on how much food they have access to. A really big black bear in a place where it's eating a lot of corn, like in Pennsylvania or someplace like that, can get 600 to 700 pounds. But the average, let's say, in the lower 48 states, would be closer to about 150 pounds, and males are bigger than females. For grizzly bears, a fully adult grizzly bear or brown bear in a coastal area might be 600 pounds, and the real big ones get up over 1,200 to 1,500 pounds, which is about the same size as a real large polar bear.
And am I correct in remembering that the individual shafts of fur on a polar bear are hollow for insulation? Is that true?
I think that's true, yeah. Polar bears have undertaken numerous adaptations to live in their very cold environment, including a thick layer of fat under their skin. And also, one of the main differences between polar bears is that except for pregnant females, they don't den during the winter. And black bears and brown grizzly bears, both sexes and both species, they always den in the winter. In places where the winter is short, like in Tennessee or Virginia, where black bears are, the denning season could be pretty short. And the same where in the southern reaches for the grizzly bear. But in areas for polar bears, one of the functions of a den is to allow females to give birth in a protected environment, where the cubs, which are born very small, can survive from the severity of the winter environment, and until they grow bigger and then they exit the den. However, for polar bears, and the other reason for denning is that food tends to be really short in the winter, and the salmon don't run, and it's hard to catch, and the vegetation is all covered up, and it's harder to catch animals, and so they don't have access to what they need in the winter, so they den up and just go into they sleep through the winter because that's the most efficient thing for them to do. Whereas for polar bears, they can catch food of seals all winter long. And therefore the only ones that den are the pregnant females, so that their cubs can be born in the protected environment of the den.
Sterling, I published that photo of you holding up 2 black bear cubs when you were on a tagging operation with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. People would like to know the story behind that picture of the 2 cubs.
Well, those were black bear cubs. One of the ways one of the main tools of bear research is putting radio transmitters on bears, and so you can track those radio transmitters which emit a signal and find out where the bear is. Typically you track them from aircraft and like a single engine Super Cub or something like that. But you can also track them wearing snowshoes on the ground during the winter and find out where their dens are. with black bears, the technique is developed that you can go into those dens in the winter and immobilize the bear that's in the den and switch out its radio collar. And that's a more cost-effective and a way of changing the collars, because the collars only last for 2.5 to 3 years. Their batteries wear out, so you want to switch out the batteries so you can keep track of the same individual. So you switch them out in the den. And sometimes they have cubs with them, and so you take the cubs out and measure those and get the sex of them. And that's always a really fun thing to do with black bears. Black bears have the way the bears are not sleeping when you go into their dens, because they're light hibernators. They're not real deep hibernators like ground squirrels or marmots or something like that. They're light hibernators. So as you're walking up to the den, the bear will wake up and they're pretty much fully awake when you go into the den, but they tend not to be aggressive. I don't know of any serious injuries that have ever happened to anybody going into a black bear den. Now, most people opt, almost everybody, including me, opt not to go into grizzly bear dens, because grizzly bears have a different response to being cornered and confronted, and it's likely to be pretty dangerous to do that. We do mark the grizzly bear dens and go into them after the bear has left, so we can measure them and determine their characteristics. But the black bear dens are really fun because they vary a lot. Some of them are in hollow trees, and you can crawl up a tree to where a branch is broken off, like of a cottonwood tree, and look down. You can see the bears in there, and I have some photographs of bears crawling up the inside of this hollow tree to investigate what I'm doing, looking down into the hole. Sometimes they're in just big jumbles of rocks. Sometimes they dig their dens under a tree, so the roots form a roof, and sometimes they're in cracks and deep caves. There's just a wide variety of dens. I've actually written a paper about the different den characteristics of both black bears and grizzly bears.
So these two cubs you got out of a den?
Yes, that's right. So I went into the den, immobilized the mother, took the cubs out, and what you see now, I have them inside my one-piece refrigerator, and just to keep them warm while we measure them. And they're really cute little suckers. There's no question about it.
In fact, I just found a photo that I will put up if somebody reminds me to tomorrow, of Jake petting a black bear cub with that Larry Allmiller had in his house, and Susan Stanford and I are there with Jake playing with this black bear cub. One of the interesting things that Sterling did was to try to remove all of the grizzly bears out of an area where there was a lot of moose to measure the impact on moose calf survival. And there were a lot of stories that he would come back from the field with on this particular project. Tell him about the time that you had the bear in the back of the pickup and stopped for gas in Glen Allen.
Yeah, well, bears have a very strong homing instinct, so they don't stay, when you move them, they have a tendency to come back to where you caught them. However, we were interested in keeping them out of that area for the period when moose calves were most vulnerable to predation by grizzly bears, which is about a 6-week period after the moose calves are born. So we captured, in this case, 49 grizzly bears and trucked them out in pickup trucks to release sites that were remote and released them there. And then one of my early papers was documenting the return rates of those grizzly bears. But as we would stop, in the case that Suzanne's talking about, when we would stop to gas up the truck, this was back in the days when sometimes there were gas station attendants that actually put gas in your truck, and they would assume the bear was dead there, and when the bear would give a big whoo like that, just a sigh, it would scare the crap out of the gas station attendant who was putting gas in the truck.
I also remember you driving home a Fish and Game truck that had a hole through the tailgate where a bear had attacked it, and it had bitten right through the tailgate.
That was the same thing. I wasn't actually there. It was some of the people that were helping me. What the tendency is, when you released a bear at the site, you had to wait there till the bear recovered. That was our protocol, just to be sure some innocent person didn't stumble on a recovering bear. And so people that were transporting the bear would not give it backup doses of tranquilizer because they didn't want to wait that long. It takes hours for the bear to recover. So sometimes the bear was starting to get pretty lively by the time we released it. And in this case, the bear was pretty much lively, and we had them on a sheet of 4x8 plywood, and so the two biologists just picked up the edges of the plywood in the back and slid the bear out of the back of the pickup truck. And when it hit the ground, it started chasing them around the truck, and they were running around the truck and trying to keep from the bear from catching them, and the bear bit the tailgate, and it was like it had been shot with a high-powered rifle. These holes right in the tailgate, which just shows you how powerful the bear's jaws are.
Yeah, I have a little story of that time as well, because Sterling was out there removing all the bears from this area. It was an area around Tangle Lakes. And so I was telling my friend we could go camping at Tangle Lakes with no fear of brown bears, because they were removing them all. And what do we have in camp the very first night? She said, well, you weren't telling the truth, Suzanne, because there was a brown bear in camp that night.
First day, we weren't right at Tangle Lakes. That's not where we were working.
You were a little north of that, weren't you?
Well, we were more west of that, over by Susitna Lodge, which is another 50 miles west. And the second place is we never anticipated we'd catch them all. We just wanted to remove enough to see whether or not that would impact moose calf survivorship.
Well, that was good enough for me to get her to go with me.
Right.
And we had a number of bear incidences while we were on float trips. One that I think is very funny, and I'll let you tell it. The time that I was cleaning fish at Mosquito Creek, and do you remember? And I left from some dead fish entrails across Mosquito Creek, and I had this dog that knew when a bear was around. She had a special bark, so she started barking, and sure enough, there was this bear. You can tell the rest of the story.
Well, we usually take a shotgun along just for bear protection, but you don't want to take your best shotgun along because it slosh around the bottom of the boat and it'd be pretty nasty. So I had this shotgun that the pump didn't work very well on, so I fixed the pump action on the shotgun with some super glue. And so when this bear came around, I wanted to let off a shot to try and discourage it. So I let off a shot in the air, and my mending job with the super glue broke. And so the shotgun was useless, which didn't inspire confidence in Suzanne and the others that were along on the trip.
It was your British relatives. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was the British relatives. And so what did we do? We moved camp, because that bear was going to be in camp. There was no question about it. He was a young guy who wanted to...
it was discretion being the better part of valor. It's just easiest thing to do was just to go camp somewhere else and sort of seed the area to this young bear. Probably this bear, was not any real danger, but and I could certainly have got off a single shot with mine. Plus we had other weapons.
With a pistol,
We had other weapons anyway, but nobody wants to kill a bear, and I've never needed to kill a bear, and I don't want to start. And so the best way to avoid that is just to move in this case, and not to make an issue about who had the right to that camping site.
A few days later, I remember, we were camped. It was a really, really windy day. It was on the Mulchatna River. The Mulchatna River is really big and a strong river, and we could barely float downriver because the wind was so strong. You remember this? So we pitched our tents in among the willows to get out of the breeze. And now everybody knew my dog's bark, the bear bark. They had heard it, and she started doing the bear bark. And so we all got out of our little camp area and went over by, there was a lot of little rivulets of the river. And sure enough, here comes a sow with several cubs, 2 or 3, I don't remember how many. But the wind was eddying, and she wasn't smelling us. You know, our dog was smelling her, but she wasn't smelling us. And so she kept kind of coming towards us. And then suddenly, she smelled us. And she stood up. Remember this? I mean, it was like she hit a wall. She stood up. She sniffed in the air and turned at about 90 degrees and took off in the other direction.
Well, but the point that Suzanne's making is a good one, is that a lot of people have a misperception about how dangerous brown bears or grizzly bears are. And in fact, in places like Alaska, people are coming into contact with brown grizzly bears all the time. And I would say, I don't know the percentage, but I would estimate 90 or 95%, the people don't even, people don't even know about it. The bear just sees them and senses them and leaves. In very rare occasions, the bear decides to make an issue of the proximity to the people. And those are usually cases when the bear is either injured, you know, by somebody shooting it and wounding it, or when the bear is protecting some food, and they're very aggressive about protecting food, like a dead moose carcass, or when the bear is surprised, the brown grizzly bear. And in those cases, there's an instinct to be aggressive on the bear, because that's the bear's a good strategy, is being aggressive, because they can't climb trees, or brown grizzly bears can't climb trees, in North America at any rate. And so they've evolved the strategy of being aggressive as a way of protecting themselves, but if they have to. But most times they don't have to. All the cases that much of the misperceptions about the aggressiveness of grizzly bears comes from the journals of Lewis and Clark, as they were traveling through North Dakota and eastern Montana and encountering their first grizzly bears. They had a lot of close encounters. Well, that was because, in large part, because every bear that they saw, they shot at and wounded with their musket loaders and so forth, which are not very powerful weapons, and didn't lots of times make very much a dent in terms of mortality on the bear. And so the bear would be irritated and would attack. And so, but they came back with all these legends and stories about how fierce the grizzly bears were, but very many of those bears had been shot first.
So, should we say goodbye here shortly, unless we have some more questions? We've kind of run out of time. Thank you, Sterling, for doing this. People were very interested. They really enjoyed talking to you. We'll have to get you on again. Bears, there's a lot more to learn about bears, and bears, Sterling has a lot of stories that he could tell about bears. Are there any more questions? I'll give it a minute or so before. Very good interview, people are saying. Yeah. Really enjoyed your talk. Okay. There's a show on Animal Planet called In Alaska. They are following bears and salmon. Yep, bears love salmon, that's for sure. There is sometime I'll have Sterling come back and we'll talk about McNeil State Game.
You should have Larry do that.
We'll have Larry too if he wants to.
Right.
It's a place where people watch salmon, and it's an incredible place. I'll try to get some films of it and some photos that we can put up while we talk about it.
The McNeil State Game Sanctuary that a friend of ours, Larry Allmiller, has been sanctuary manager of for many years. The place where humans and bears are in very close proximity. Suzanne and I have been there quite often, and we've been as close to a female suckling her cubs as that chair.
Yeah.
You can hear the cubs suckling on the female.
It's incredible.
And it's a place where there's really, really a lot of brown bears because it's a very concentrated place to catch salmon. And in almost 50 years of the existence of this sanctuary, they've never had a person injured by a bear, and they've never had to kill a bear.
Yeah, it's very controlled. The human behavior is controlled. Yeah, and
but these are completely wild bears.
Right, and they're beautiful. They're incredible. Yeah.
I think about half or more of the pictures you see of bears fishing for salmon are taken there at the McNeil, and the other half are taken at a place fairly close to that in Katmai National Park.
Brooks Camp, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Sterling. People really like this. We'll have to have you back.
All right.
Okay. Wave goodbye. Thanks a lot. See you next time.